one of the few times I don't have to raise the microphone when I speak. So as Rabbi Kaminker told you, 38 years ago, I went on a mission for Chabad to the Soviet Union. I volunteered. And just to give you a little bit of a background, the Jews were persecuted, along with members of other religions as well, Christians as well, when the communists took over in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, and the Union and USSR was established. It was an atheistic regime which hated religion, and if you were a Jew and you wanted to practice circumcision, teaching Judaism, keeping kosher, having a chasana, you were in danger of being jailed and exiled to Siberia. And during this period, it was really the Lubavitch organization, the Lubavitch Rebbes, who kept a little spark of Judaism alive in the USSR. It was one of the most important organizations to not allow Judaism to perish entirely. So when I heard about the opportunity to visit refuseniks, and those of you who don't know, a refusnik was a Jew who applied from the USSR to emigrate to Israel, and they were refused, almost always. They were refused by the authorities, were not allowed to go, but that wasn't the end of it. They were persecuted. They were fired from their jobs. They were jailed because they were parasites. They didn't have a job. First they fired them, then they jailed them for not having a job because they were parasites. They were constantly monitored by the KGB, by the Secret Service, and so forth. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe, along with many of his Hasidim, established an organization called Lishkas Ezras Achim in 1964. It is the organization Ezrat Achim, to help our brothers. And it sent shluchim secretly to the USSR to bring whatever material and spiritual help to the Jews who were being persecuted there. You were not allowed to go to the USSR unless you were a tourist, so that the KGB could keep their eye on you. You couldn't go there and just visit people in their homes. And nevertheless, that is what was expected of the people who went on this mission. Now, I went on this mission, and I went with two huge suitcases that were filled with talesim, tefillin, expensive cameras which could be given to Jews who had no source of income, who could sell the cameras on the black market and get money to sustain them. Shmura Matzah, I went in March of 1986, right after Purim and before Pesach. I also went with something that I wouldn't be able to get on board a plane today. I went with a 13-inch sword for shchita, called a chalaf. You could not get kosher food. There was an individual called Yitzchak Kogan who lived in Leningrad. This man was taught how to do shchita according to Jewish law, but he needed to have the appropriate knife. It has to be a special knife with which to slaughter large animals. There's a small knife for chickens and fowl. There's a big knife if you want to slaughter a cow. And so my job was to somehow get this 13-inch knife in my luggage, past the people, and give it to Rabbi Kogan in Leningrad. And he was an extraordinary individual. He was called the Tzaddik of Leningrad, the righteous man of Leningrad, because he would travel to Siberia to help refuseniks who had been jailed there. So I come to Sheremetyevo Airport, and the guy opens up my bags, and he sees that I've got Jewish items. Right away he says, "You're a Zionist, you're a spy. Who sent you?" "Oh, I'm just here as a tourist." "Why do you have 6 books?" I had 6 Jewish books to bring in. "Why do you have 6 books?" "I like to read." 6 books is too much for a two-week stay in the USSR. "I'm going to take these books, pick 2 from the 6 books, and those you will be allowed in." I picked 2 of the best books. One of them was a dictionary, which allowed them to translate Aramaic to Hebrew so they can learn Gemara. Then he said, "These 2 you may not take. Now pick from the other 4. outsmarted me in a very awful, horrible way. So I had to take 2 of the less important books. And then they came on to the knife. What do you have this knife for? I had anticipated that I would be asked this question, so my wife packed in my bag a huge salami and a huge pumpernickel, and I said, well, I can travel with this and I need it now. It sounded ridiculous, but the guy said to me, first of all, they called the KGB man over, the plainclothes man. He took the knife out and he went like this. Zorro, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a TV program of a guy who was a swordsman, and he took it and he says, Zorro. But they let me take it in, but he said, you have to take it out again. What I did was, I eventually made it to Leningrad. I gave it to Rabbi Kogan, and I took back a different knife that was not a kosher knife, and that was the way I was able to get this in. So, what did I do when I was in the USSR? I was given a list of refuseniks to visit, to give them the things that I had brought. Now, I didn't speak Russian, and they didn't speak English. How did we communicate? We communicated in Hebrew. I speak reasonably good Hebrew. They had self-taught Hebrew. Would I call them up from my hotel room and say, I'll meet you in such and such a street? Of course not, because your hotel room was bugged. So I was told, and I had to go through a preparation for this. This was like being a 007. I had to make all of my calls from a payphone, and I would call them up, and I said, I will meet you on, I took the metro. They have one thing I'll say about the USSR, they had guns, bombs, and a nice metro. That's it. And a beautiful subway. And I taught myself to read Cyrillic. So the signs were not in English, they were written in Cyrillic. I had to teach myself how to read, so I would, if they told me you have to meet me at such and such a place, I would have to be able to read it. So I would meet them, I'd say I'm going to be in the second car, I'm 6'4", I'm wearing a blue hat, and they would meet me there, we wouldn't say anything, we would walk out. This is like you see in the movies. And then they would take me to their house, and I would bring them whatever it is that I had. And I was so inspired by the bravery of these individuals. These were Chabadniks, these were people who were devoted to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They were teaching their children, little children, 10 and 12 years old, to read Hebrew, to read the Torah and so forth. And hopefully they were trying to get out of the Soviet Union and emigrate to Israel. So I visited many of these people. I also visited some people. I was sent also by the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. I had another list of people to see. And I also brought my doctor bag with me, an old-fashioned black doctor bag with some medications, with a stethoscope, and they organized secret medical clinics in a person's house. The word went out among these people. There's a doctor from New York, from Columbia. If you come with your medical problem, maybe he can give you some advice. And I saw dozens and dozens of people, children, older people, middle-aged people, and I felt so helpless because they would tell me, and there was a translator for me, they would tell me their problem, and I knew that if they were in New York, they would be getting this drug or that drug. Forget it. In Russia and the Soviet Union, unless you were a member of the Communist Party, you did not have access to these basic necessities. So it just broke my heart when I could give them some advice and I knew what they needed, but I couldn't fulfill this. When I came back to the United States, by the way, I wrote an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal that was entitled Soviet Healthcare's Critical Condition, in which I spoke about how horrible the medical care was for the average person in the Soviet Union. This was a big deal, and I got letters to the editor that confirmed how awful this was, a place that made Sputnik and atom bombs and couldn't provide their people with the most basic and decent medical care. As far as the books are concerned, I told you how the Soviets were freaked out by books. You can have subversive things. They didn't want information. They want to keep their people under their thumb. I was told that if I went to the American embassy in Moscow and went to a certain woman and gave her a code word, she would take me. I went to this lady. I went with 2 empty suitcases, past 2 Soviet guards who were standing in front of the American embassy. I went to this lady. I told her this code word and didn't say anything more because the American embassy is bugged. They know everything that was going on. And she took me to a closet, opened up the closet with a key, and there were hundreds of Jewish books in this closet. How did they get there? Because if you're a diplomat, and this goes around the world, you have diplomatic immunity in terms of what you can get in and take out. They don't search your luggage. So various organizations would give Jewish books to diplomats who were going to the Soviet Union. They would drop them off at the American embassy and they would keep them. I loaded up the 2 suitcases with books. You try to carry 2 suitcases filled with books. It was extremely heavy. I could only carry so much, obviously. But when I left the embassy, I did not want to look like I'm schlepping something. This would excite, like, what is this guy doing? So I had to put in as much as I could carry, took a deep breath of air, and I walked out like I was carrying just diapers in the thing instead of books. When I came to a home of one of the refuseniks, and I opened up the suitcases, he cried. He had never seen so many Jewish books in one place like this. And all through the day, people would come, 1 person at a time, 2 people would come, would take 1 book, would take 2 books. This is the situation that occurred. And I'll finish by saying that when I spent the Shabbat in Leningrad with the Tzaddik of Leningrad, with Yitzhak Kogan, I brought him the knife. He was so thrilled about that. There was a person over there, a 19-year-old young man who was a refusenik. His name was Moshe Osman. And he said to me, could you please teach me the truck, how to say the Haftarah? And I said, I'd be happy to. He said, tomorrow is Sunday. Come to my mother's house and we will record the truck. You make it for me and I would like to learn, which is what I did. Now, I happened to use as the Haftarah to teach him what I consider to be the most beautiful Haftarah in the entire year, which is Nachamu, Nachamu, Shabbos Nachamu. After Tisha B'Av, it is a beautiful, beautiful Haftarah from Isaiah. And I used that. I first told him what the truck was, and I recorded that. Well, fast forward 37 years. Last year, Shabbos Nachamu, I'm in Englewood where I live. And somebody comes over to me on Shabbos and says, you know, the chief rabbi of Ukraine said that there was a tall doctor from Englewood who taught him the truck for this Shabbos Nachamu, and he's here today. He forgot the name, but somebody called out, it must be Prager, a tall doctor from Englewood who went to Soviet Union. And I met Rabbi Osman. He's the chief rabbi of Ukraine today. And so we had a get-together, Shabbos Nachamu. He came over to my house after Shabbos, and we schmoozed and we talked and so forth. There was an article in the Jewish Standard about that. It's really, really quite amazing. So in conclusion, I'll finish off by saying for me this was a life-changing experience. It just goes to show you the greatness and the goodness of the Lubavitch movement, how they, through little things, people taking in a couple of suitcases, how much this meant to persecuted Jews in the Soviet Union. And I'll just finish by telling you that when I came back, somebody had asked me when I was in the Soviet Union, they said, you know, there's a Jewish man, a Russian Jew who is in Israel who has leukemia, and he needs a bone marrow transplant to live. Michael Sherman. And his sister, who can be his donor, his bone marrow donor, lives in Moscow, and they will not let her out to go to Israel. See what you can do to get her out. I say to myself, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to call up Gorbachev and say, be a nice guy and let this lady out? Well, I came back, and there was the Chernobyl explosion right after I came back. And the United States was sending somebody over to do bone marrow transplants for the Soviet firemen who had exposure to lethal doses of radiation. And I thought that this might be a way to get to Gorbachev. And the fellow who was going there, by Armand Hammer, who took him, was a person by the name of Robert Peter Gale. Didn't sound Jewish. I dialed 411 for information to see if I could get to this guy. And they gave me his home number. I call up and I say, can I speak to Dr. Gale? And a little girl answers. She says, he's not home, my mother is. Would you like to speak to my mother? I said, sure. And she goes, Ima, whoa, he's Jewish, his wife is from Israel, and so forth. And so I told her the story. She spoke to Gale. Gale spoke to Gorbachev. And Gorbachev actually said, I'll see what I can do. Unfortunately, the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union put obstacles in front of it. However, to make a long story short, I went to the New York Times, I went to the media, this was taken up. A number of months later, I came back in March. In October, right before Sukkot, the Soviet Union allowed out the sister to go to Israel. She turned out, with her family, with her husband and 2 little girls, she turned out to be a perfect match. They did the transplant. Unfortunately, it was too late because they had stalled so late, and he passed away, Michael Sherman. But at least his sister, his brother-in-law, and the 2 little girls were allowed out. So this is a story of an event and really an experience that was truly life-changing, thanks to the Rebbe and thanks to Chabad. Thank you for your attention.